Greetings everyone, Brett from Hammerhead Monomaking here, and I've got a special episode for you today. As of the date of this airing, it is currently December 7th, 2021. This is the 80th anniversary of the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941. And for this video I chose to build Airfix's 148 scale P-40B. Today marks the 80th anniversary of the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, and to help provide some context to the build that I am building, I asked my father to put together a presentation about this particular airplane, about its pilot, Lieutenant Welsh, and about the attack on Pearl Harbor in general. My dad spent some considerable time growing up living in Hawaii and has quite a connection there. So this is kind of a special thing for him to do, and I was really excited that he agreed to do this. So later on in the video, my father will come in and he will provide some more context to this build. So for this build, I wanted to create a really clean airplane. I was not going to go heavy on weathering at all, and really present the airplane as it would have looked in its pre-war time. Technically, at the time of Pearl Harbor, they were not in wartime conditions, and the airplanes were pretty well maintained on a prepared airfield. Well, what I'm doing right now is I've base coated everything with Vallejo's flat black primer, and this is really my first time using this for a whole project, and ultimately I wasn't a huge fan of it. It sprayed really nicely, it went on with a nice kind of a semi-gloss scheme, but I just never really felt like it had the grip that it needed for a good proper primer. There was a few times painting the exterior where the paint would actually lift off in a few places and I had to go back and touch it up, and I've never really had that problem with my good old trusty Rust-Oleum primer. But with this one I really wanted to just try something new, see if I could use an airbrush primer, but I don't think I will keep using it for an entire project. I think for things like interiors it worked really well, where I don't have to do a lot of masking, but as a whole project primer, not a fan. For the cockpit, I did want to experiment with doing some chipping, even though with the exterior I'm going to be relatively clean, and I was really quite happy with the results here. Using MIG products, the MIG chipping fluid, it worked really well, it was really easy to work with, and I was really quite happy with the results. The cockpit that is provided by Airfix for this kit is really well detailed. I was really impressed and pleased with just how detailed the cockpit was and how well everything fit together. The only thing I ended up adding to this build as an aftermarket was a photo etch seatbelt from Edward. But really, it really doesn't need anything else other than that. The detail for the instrument panel was really nice. The sidewall detail is really nice. It all kind of sandwiches together in this neat little cage system, which you'll see later, and then fits in really well into the fuselage. I gotta give Airfix props for this because I was really impressed with it. They give you two options for the pilot seat, the round topped one that I'm using here, and then a square topped one. I believe the square topped one is for if you build the American Volunteer Group version of the airplane that it comes with decals for. But in my research it looked like the P-40Bs flown at Pearl Harbor had the rounded topped. All of the brush painting you'll see in this video is done with Vallejo acrylics. I've just found that I've been using them for more than 10 years now, and I've just found that in terms of brush painting, it's really hard to do better than the Vallejo acrylics. You can get them in just a massive range of colors, and their consistency is great. They thin really well, and I like the way they look. And it'll be hard for me to find a good suitable replacement for Vallejo acrylics when it comes to actual brush painting the details. The exception to that is metallics. I don't necessarily care for the Vallejo brush metallics, and really when it comes to a brushable metallic, I've found the Citadel range of metallics are really great, and I've always gravitated towards those. The decal for the instrument panel fit absolutely perfectly. I was a little nervous. I've noticed in my experience that it tends to be hit and miss when it comes to how well instrument panel decals actually fit to the detail on the instrument panel. But this Airfix one, it was spot on. And later on, you'll see me adding a little bit more detail to the instrument panel, and you can see just how well it lined up. Here you can see I've actually added the Eduard photo etch seat belts, and in the process of painting them up. I know a lot of people don't necessarily love photo etch seat belts because they don't have a good natural weight to them, but I find that they're sufficient for my needs, and I think they really help dress up the cockpit and add a lot of detail. So during my research of the early war P-40Bs, from what I could tell, it looked like the interior of the radiator and oil cooler on the bottom of the nose of the aircraft was painted the same color as the underside body color. So here I'm just pre-painting the radiator inlet and exit exhaust area as well as the inside of the fuselage halves to match. I decided to use super glue to assemble all of the cockpit. I did this so that I wouldn't have to worry about trying to scrape away paint to provide a good connection for the plastic cement. And I like the way that the super glue sets really fast, and so I can get it assembled quickly and make sure everything's aligned properly. Like I mentioned before, I'm just really pleased with the level of detail in the cockpit. Airfix really outdid themselves with this one. And unlike the Mustang that I built earlier this year, I don't feel like they over-engineered at least this portion of this kit. It was very logical the way it went together. It installs into the fuselage in a very logical way with large locating tabs. It's really well thought out how this worked together and fit together. Another unique feature of the P-40B is you can actually see the back end of the 50 caliber receivers in the front of the cockpit. They extended into the cockpit from over the engine, and the pilot could actually physically manipulate those guns in terms of cocking them and clearing jams and whatnot. That's very much a kind of a pre-war design that the United States stopped doing after the war started. You don't really see many American planes with guns mounted over the engine pretty much after this point. Again, using super glue to secure everything in place, putting the fuselage halves together. For the most part, this fit well, and I really didn't have a lot of trouble. The biggest issue I had with getting the fuselage halves together was this large seam on the underside neath of the engine cowl. No matter what I did, and I pulled parts out and tried to move them around and get it to fit correctly, and I just could not get this seam to close on the underside of the fuselage. So what I ended up doing there was actually inserting a piece of evergreen styrene into that gap, gluing it in there, trimming it, and essentially using that as my initial gap filler. Right here you can see that, and it was that big of a gap. One of the things that I like about Airfix kits is the soft plastic. And I know for a lot of people that's a negative thing, but I have found that the soft plastic on Airfix kits really sands really well and easily, and a lot of times I can get away with sanding a seam without ever having to use any kind of filler whatsoever. There were a few places on this kit, as you can see here, that I ended up using some Tamiya putty to fill in the gaps. I just couldn't get it without it. But in the end, it really wasn't that much, and I ended up using a lot more filler than I actually needed. Other than the underside of the nose, which once I got putty on there, it actually sanded out really quickly, that I had trouble with was these little chin areas where the front end of the radiator scoop attaches. Those were rather prominent seams that aren't on the actual aircraft, so those required a little bit of work. The rest of the construction went together rather quickly. I ended up giving the elevators a little bit of an upward cant. I just kind of like the look that it gives an aircraft model to have the control surfaces at odd angles. The other biggest issue with this kit is the nose spinner. Really huge gaps, did not fit well, and really the only way that I could think of to correct that was to actually cut off the propeller blades and have them off separate so that I could actually sand out the propeller hub and get a nice, good, smooth finish there. So I used fluoro wire to pin those so that I could add them later. The rest of the construction was pretty straightforward. Everything fit together as it should. This kit has unique fillet inserts for the wings, and I was a little concerned, but they fit really well and really nicely. The wings fit well, and overall it went together well. So here you can see I've actually sanded down the spinner quite a bit. I needed a lot of putty in there to get that to fit flush, and now I'm hitting it with some primer. Again, I'm using that Vallejo primer. Not sure I'll be using it for exterior stuff, although I do like the actual finish you get once it's painted on. I just didn't like its adhesion. It just did not adhere well to the plastic. You can see I've actually filled in the radiator area with foam. This was to protect the parts that I had already painted and to keep those clean. After the primer was done, you can actually see here that I had to go back and resand a few seams and get those taken care of. So just in a moment, we'll be hearing from my dad for his first portion of his presentation. So please enjoy.
The P-40B that Brett is modeling started its life as the Curtiss P-36 Hawk, also known as the Curtiss Hawk Model 75, an American-designed and built fighter aircraft of the 1930s. Conceived by veteran aircraft designer Don Berlin, the P-36 first flew in 1934. It was one of the first of a new generation of combat aircraft, a sleek monoplane design with retractable undercarriage, making extensive use of metal in its construction. The aircraft's extreme low wing loading gave it outstanding turn performance, and its high power-to-weight ratio gave it superb climbing performance for the time. However, the single-speed supercharger was a serious handicap at high altitudes. In 1937, the U.S. Army Corps began taking bids for a single-seat, twin-engine, high-altitude interceptor fighter aircraft. Lockheed was awarded the contract to build the P-38, which had two Allison V-1710 engines. The Allison V-1710 aircraft engine, designed and produced by Allison Engine Company, was the only U.S.-developed V-12 liquid-cooled engine to see service during World War II. Versions with a turbocharger gave excellent performance at high altitude, just what the P-36 needed. Don Berlin married the P-36 with the Allison V-1710 engine to create the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, an American single-engine, single-seat, all-metal fighter and a ground attack aircraft that first flew in 1938. Curtiss received the largest order yet placed for an American fighter, 524 P-40s, for the total price of $13 million. The P-40 went through 19 different model designations and stayed in production until 1944. There seems to be a little conflict on the data on how many P-40s were built, but let's say it's somewhere between 13,000 and 17,000. To put that number in context, we all know about the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies. The Boeing 747 has been in production for 50 years, and in that 50 years, Boeing has only created 1,500 747s. The model that Brett is building is the B variant, the P-40B, also known as the Tomahawk Mark IIA. 131 were built as P-40Bs. Though strongly built, the first P-40As were poorly protected and lacked armor and self-sealing tanks. This was partially rectified with the P-40B, which had additional armor behind the cockpit and partially self-healing tanks. But the fuel system and control line still remained vulnerable. The P-40B also had an additional 30 caliber machine gun in each wing. This specific model, the P-40B number 160 that Brett is modeling, made history during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. After receiving his wings and commission in January 1941, Lieutenant George Welsh was posted to the 47th Pursuit Squadron, 15th Pursuit Group at Wheeler Field, Oahu, Hawaii, in February 1941. At dawn on December 7th, 1941, 2nd Lieutenant Welsh and another pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth M. Taylor, were coming back from a Christmas dinner and dance party at a rooftop hotel in Waikiki that ended in an all-night poker game. They were still wearing their mess dress when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Welch telephoned the auxiliary Haleiwa fighter strip, which was not under attack, on Oahu's North Shore, to have 2 Curtiss P-40B Tomahawk fighters prepared for takeoff. Welch and Taylor immediately drove Taylor's Buick at high speed to Haleiwa to join the air battle. While climbing into their P-40s, the crew chiefs informed them that they were not fully armed. "To hell with that," Welch said. Taking off with only 30 caliber ammunition in their wing guns, Welch claimed 2 kills of Japanese dive bombers over the Eva mooring mast field. The first Japanese aircraft was only damaged and made it back to the carrier, while the second was finished off by Taylor shortly before they landed at Wheeler Field to get 50 caliber ammo. On his second sortie, Welch shot down another dive bomber, which was behind Ken Taylor and crashed into the community of Wahiawa, and then one Zero fighter about 5 miles west of Barber's Point. Both Lieutenant Welch and Lieutenant Taylor were nominated for the Medal of Honor by General Henry H. Arnold, but were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest U.S. Army Medal for Valor, for their actions.
Continuing on with the build, we can start painting out the exterior portions. There's some decent detail in the wheel wells, but what's especially nice is the canvas covers that were inside the wheel wells are really well represented in this kit. There's some good folds. You can see those snap rivets that they use to apply them. And so here I'm just brush painting in a khaki color for that canvas, and then I'm going to dry brush it with a lighter color. And this will really help make those folds of that canvas pop and that detail pop out. Once that's done, mask off the wheel wells and I can begin painting. Here I'm using MIG paints, and one of the things that I've noticed using MIG paints is that they tend to spray on kind of granular. You can actually really see that well here painting the other side, but they level out really well and provide a nice smooth finish. I'm really happy with the way that these paints work and the result that they give, and I think the color is really nice. Moving on to the upper side, I noticed in my research that the demarcation line between the olive drab and the neutral gray was a very hard line, so I just simply masked it off and painted the upper surfaces. And again, this paint functions and looks very similar to the underside paint, where it kind of sprays on granular, but then really evens out and creates a really nice solid color. And again, I wasn't going for huge amount of fading and pre-shading here because I wanted to really show a nice, well-tamed, relatively new aircraft. Another unique thing about these P-40Bs is that the way that the propellers were painted. The front faces of the propellers were left metallic. However, the back sides of the propellers were painted black. And I really liked the way that this looked, and I thought it was a really neat aspect of this aircraft. So it was really fun to represent that here. And so here you can see I'm just painting the yellow tips, but one side is black and one side is metallic. Getting them installed was rather simple enough because of the work that I had done earlier with the pinning, and they seated in there nice and tight, and I'm really pleased with the way they looked. So moving on to the gloss coat, again I'm using Alclad's Aqua Gloss here. Give the whole thing a nice good solid coat of gloss in preparation for decals and for a panel wash. I've generally not had any problem with Airfix decals, and this kit was no exception. The decals were nice and thin. As far as I could tell, they were in good register and pretty accurate in terms of color. You should note, though, that if you are building the American Volunteer Group version of this kit, that the national insignias for the Chinese Air Force are actually missing a point and are not correct. So if you want to go for accuracy, you should source some aftermarket decals. But for the U.S. Army version, I didn't find any issues or problems, and the decals applied really nicely. There's a good number of stencils, so I applied all the stencils first and then applied the larger markings, and everything worked as it should, and they were really easy to work with. Positioning them is quite simple. Just get a little bit of water on there, get them to the right place, and here I'm checking constantly between left and right side to make sure they're all lining up and even. And then I hit everything with my Walthers Solvaset. This decal setting solution is rather aggressive, but it works perfectly with these Airfix decals, and it never has any negative reaction with the Alclad gloss coat. So this really is kind of my go-to, and I mostly use it for everything and every project I do. Once the decals were done, I did want to add a panel line finish just to kind of make those panel lines pop. So I'm using MIG's panel line wash for green vehicles, which is quite fitting in this instance. And really, I didn't want to go too heavy, but just I wanted to make sure I could get all the little recesses and nooks and crannies. Once the panel line wash had dry, it's just a matter of taking a paper towel or a cotton bud and wiping off the excess. I generally try to wipe in the direction of the airflow when I can, just because that kind of you can kind of use that to help give a little bit of weathering. But for the most part with this kit, I wiped off all the excess that I could, and because I was going for a not very dirty aircraft, but I still wanted those panel lines to pop and to be able to see that detail. That's why I added the panel line wash at all. The reason why I like the MIG product is because it's so easy to remove, and you don't usually have to use any thinner to remove it, and as opposed to the Tamiya panel liner, which I always feel is really difficult to get rid of. So once the panel liner's done, the decals are done, it's just a matter of hitting it with a semi-gloss matte coat and to kind of knock down some of that shine and to seal in all the work that I've done up to that point. There are a few little details to paint before I can start adding all the finishing touches, namely these fuel filler caps behind the cockpit. So before we move on to the finishing touches of the aircraft, I'm going to bring my father back on to kind of give an overview of the order of events that took place during the Battle of Pearl Harbor.
This is a view of the island of Oahu from Google Earth, and I would just want to point out a few things on the map relating to not only the story of Pearl Harbor being attacked, but also the story of the P-40B 160 that Brett is modeling. If we zoom in here, we will see this is Ford Island, Naval Air Station at the time. This was attacked. If we go in further, this was Battleship Row. Of course, that was attacked. Right here, you can see the Arizona, and this is the Missouri, and you can probably hear my cuckoo clock going off. In this area were all the oil reserves that were not attacked, and over here were more oil reserves that were not attacked. Down here is Hickam Air Force Base. I guess it was Army Air Corps Base then, and it's connected to the Honolulu International Airport. This was also attacked. We zoom out just a little bit. On this side of the island, this is the Kaneohe Marine Base. It was attacked. And down further, this is the old Bellows Air Force Base, and it was also attacked. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. We're going to come into the middle of the island, and this is Wheeler, and it was attacked. So all those airstrips were attacked. But up here on the North Shore, in the little town of Haleiwa, is Haleiwa Airstrip, and this was not attacked, and this plays a crucial role in our story today. For anybody who's a surfer, right in here is the Bonsai Pipeline, and up here is, of course, the famous North Shore, Waimea Bay, and Sunset Beach for all you surfers. All right, Haleiwa. So remember that as we get into the story of our P-40B. So let's kind of draw out the events of the morning of December 7th, 1941. So the Japanese, the first wave came in, headed down the center of the island, and headed right for Ford Island, where they get their first battleship, the USS Utah. Unfortunately for them, the Utah was a target ship. It sank. It's still there, but no big damage. Part of this group broke off and bombed Wheeler. There they did a lot of damage. A lot of planes were destroyed. Part of this group went down this side of the mountains and into Pearl Harbor this way. And another part went down around this, all the way around here, came in and came this way. Of course, right in here by Ford Island is their prime targets, Battleship Row. None of our aircraft carriers were in port that day, so their primary targets were the battleships. Another group, I can't tell you which ship it was from, came down this direction, flew in over Kaneohe Bay, across the Ko'ola Mountains, and in to do their deed. Part of that group broke off and bombed the Kaneohe Marine Station, and a few went down and bombed Bellows, right here, Air Force Base. Now, our boys, our heroes, George and Ken, they're right down here. And they're driving back to Wheeler when the attack starts. They see that that Wheeler's been bombed. They stop. They make a call up to Haleiwa, and they're told that Haleiwa is not being bombed, and they hightail it up here to Haleiwa Airstrip, where there's two P-40Bs waiting for them. Now, what they do, let's change colors again. Okay, so they take off and they come down, and we're told that they engage the enemy at Barber's Point, which is right over here, and Eva Beach, which is right over here. And then they go back and land in Wheeler and get more ammunition and take off again. And we know they shot a plane down that landed here in Wahiwa. And again, they go out and they shoot down another one out here by Barbers Point. So those are kind of the events of the day that have to do with our two heroes and the P-40B that Brett's been modeling.
So as we near the end of our build, I mentioned earlier that my father had somewhat of a connection to Hawaii, and in fact his mother lived in Hawaii during the attack on Pearl Harbor. So to close out this video, he's going to recount some of the stories that she's passed along about her time in Hawaii before and after the attack.
My mother grew up in Hawaii and lived there when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. She was 13, and as she recalls it, there was a big test that she was studying for Monday, and she was quite worried that she wasn't going to do well on it. Pearl Harbor was bombed, school was canceled, and she was happy. Of course, to a 13-year-old, not really understanding what was actually happening. One of the other things that she did was that they handed out gas masks to all of the residents in Hawaii, and she and her girlfriend were volunteers to go and pass out gas masks. She also talked about how they couldn't have lights on, they couldn't drive cars at night because no lights. And she does recall looking out over Honolulu and at night, and there were no lights. Years later, going back to Hawaii, she could never go out to Pearl Harbor. That was still part of her, and it was too painful to go out and go to the Arizona Memorial or even go in and around that area. Shortly after the bombing in 1942, my grandfather was, he worked for Eastman Kodak at the time, and so he went abroad. He left there on assignment from Kodak, which left my grandmother, my mother, and my uncle alone in Hawaii. They were trying to get all the non-essential people off the island. And so they left on the Lurleen and ended up at Lake Tahoe, where she went to high school and actually met my dad there. But Pearl Harbor was always definitely a part of her life and her memories. And as I think she got older and understood what really happened, it became darker and darker for her.
To close out this video, I want to thank my father for providing some unique insight into these events, and also to simply say that I hope this humble video will act as tribute to all the men who paid the ultimate price and gave their life in pursuit of freedom of this country, and thank you for watching.